So excited to have Mark Logue and David Seidler here with us tonight. This year marks the 10-year anniversary of the King's Speech, and we are delighted that they could join us here to discuss stammering and the role that it's had in their lives. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
David, before we get into it, can you just tell us what inspired you to write the King's Speech?
Sure. It was a very personal story. As a writer, I've always found it extremely difficult to write about myself directly per se. I can't imagine why anybody would be interested in David Seidler. But if you are the king or about to become the King of England, and the whole Commonwealth and the world is looking to you to be a leader and to speak, the stakes are very high. So it was the ability to write about my stuttering through the king.
But the knowledge also that in defending ourselves, we were defending the liberties of the whole world.
As a little boy in America during the war, my parents would let me listen to his BBC speeches. And my mother would say, well, David, listen to him. He was much worse than you, and he can give these wonderful, stirring addresses. There's hope for you. And then hope is an essential ingredient in dealing with stuttering, I believe.
Curious, we know stuttering does run in families. Do you have a family history of stammering?
Yes, I do. My mother's brother, my Uncle David, was a profound stutterer. And we learned many years later that my grandfather had been a stutterer as a boy and as a young man. My uncle, he had asked to read the script and I'd let him do so. And then just before we were filming, he said, that fellow in your script, Australian, wasn't he? I said, yes, Uncle, you read the script. He's Australian. Logue, right? I said, yes, Uncle, Logue. He said, yes, your grandfather, my father, wasted a great deal of money sending me to him. He was an absolute crook. Absolute scoundrel. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, all the bloody man wanted to do was talk about my childhood. I said, yes, but Uncle, you don't stutter anymore. And he said, oh, I would have outgrown it, I'm sure.
Speaking of that, do you know if the king had a family history of stuttering?
George V had stuttered as a young child. We do know that there is a propensity for stuttering that is inherited. And if you have the propensity and the trigger mechanisms happen at the right time, as it were, you start to stutter.
There were stories of him aged 8 standing in his class and being asked a question or, to answer a simple sum, and he'd stand there lockjawed and then, ridiculed by kids his age. So that would not have helped. And that, I think that went on for most of his adolescence. So all of those moments that most of us could get through, he didn't have any of the kind of the techniques to kind of deal with it.
And of course, the teasing by his own family. His father would, spit it out, boy, that sort of thing. His brother teasing him as these things contribute to an inner state where you feel that your voice is not being heard. And I feel personally that is one of the strong causal mechanisms, one of the trigger mechanisms.
Yes, Mark, can you tell us about the work that your grandfather did with the king?
My grandfather originally was born in Australia, and it was only 2 years after he emigrated, after he arrived in London, that he actually met the king, the Duke at the time. And so things progressed quite quickly, and he reached a certain competence, but obviously it wasn't until 1936 that he was catapulted into a different kind of arena after the abdication that things really heated up for him. Actually, I have the original appointment card actually with me here. So the first appointment on this was dated October 19th, 1926. So that was just only 2 years after my grandfather arrived in England. And after that, there comes, literally hundreds of appointments. So I show it to you here. It's a rather kind of dog-eared document. Wow. I don't think it comes across in the thing. So,
well, I understand you also have your grandfather's notebooks where he recorded session notes.
There is one, and this is it. This is the one session note. So he wrote about his first meeting with the king. He says he's quite normal, has an acute nervous tension, which has been brought on by the defect, is of a nervous disposition. His physical comments was well built with good shoulders, but waistline very flabby, good chest development, top lung breathing good, has never used diaphragm or lower lung. This has resulted in, through non-control of solar plexus, in nervous tension with consequent periods of bad health and depression. It's worth remembering that the Duke at that stage thought that he was mentally deficient, right? He thought that he was incurable and that there was something wrong with him. And it wasn't until my grandfather came along and said, "This is completely treatable. You know, there's nothing wrong with you."
I can assure you that as a stutterer, as I was and still am, you know, born a stutterer, you're always a stutterer. It is depressing. Particularly, it would be extremely depressing as a grown man.
My first word must be one of praise for...
And so that poor man, by the time he saw your grandfather, would have been truly depressed by the situation that he was in, a situation not of his own making and not of his own fault.
Many people are very curious about the actual speech techniques as shown in the film, and it was a drama. So, you know, we're curious how much of the techniques were actually those that were used in the therapy.
The techniques employed by the king's physicians before he met Logue, I couldn't speak about. I believe they're contemporary with what was going on at the time. David, that was your research, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. That all the marbles in the mouth and all this kind of stuff. That was
And smoking.
Yeah, incredible.
They prescribed smoking. It would relax the throat. I was told to start smoking when I was about 13, I think.
Wow. Oh my goodness. So Mark, as seen in the movie, your grandfather worked many, many hours along with the king. Can you tell us about the work that they did together?
The main exercises he did were the upper to being the most comfortable chair in London. You know, so I think that speaks to not so much about the chair he bought, but about the environment that he had built for the king, a place away from the palace, anything that to relax him and to make it feel at home that was used.
Very interesting. Like you said, a lot of those techniques really only address the physical aspects of stuttering, when we know that the relationship between the client and the therapist accounts for more of the benefit than the actual techniques used. To me, the most powerful scene in the movie was when Geoffrey Rush, who's playing your grandfather, sits in the throne and basically prompts the king to force him to get out of the chair. To, you know, the confidence that we try to give people who stutter. You know, and you were saying before, David, making them feel that they do have a voice. You know, it's all about that. When you feel safe and comfortable and that you're not being judged, then you achieve more natural fluency. And that's what we try to do in therapy.
I got over my stuttering, and I've spoken to other stutterers who did the same thing, as an act of defiance. I'm not going to be silent the rest of my life. If you don't want to listen to it, you can just move on and go somewhere else. That's fine. But I'm going to keep talking. So again, it's the same mental leap. I'm free to stutter. And once you're free to stutter, you don't.
Mark, what was it like for you to see your grandfather's work brought to screen?
I never met my grandfather. So he died before I was born. There was actually very little mentioned of him. I discovered, I didn't know anything about the archives that he'd kept, the letters to the king, the journals, or any of that stuff growing up. There were a few portraits of the king sitting on the mantelpiece, but nothing. And they were signed and with little messages on the back. But I just thought there, and I'm pleased. I'm really pleased. I managed, and David Seidler is probably cursing me to this day, but I'm really pleased that some of the archives, some of the voice, the actual voice managed to get into the film, and a lot of it, evidently. And that when I listen to that, and it resonates because I see it in the letters, and I see, I see the character come alive, and so yeah, it's just it's great. It's like coming face to face with your grandfather.
Making the King's Speech with these two actors, they would cross-examine me for days about what it feels like to be a stutterer physiologically. Where's the tightens in the throat, the compression of the chest, and then psychologically what it was like.
I don't know if you know, but watching your film is a desensitization exercise for many people who stutter. Many people, just the way they have trouble facing and accepting that they themselves stutter, watching your film is for some people very, very painful. That scene when you see the king looking at the microphone and focused on it. And I, as a person who doesn't stutter, I felt the unbelievable tension of that moment. And I know people who stutter, are almost holding their breath in those moments. It feels so personal. And I think that there will be now a second generation of kids who now will be watching that film, especially with Biden now in office, the second very powerful world leader who has a stammer or a stutter, as we call it in the United States. It's just a fascinating context.
You're talking about Biden, morning after the Oscars, maybe the second morning, and the phone rang, and I hear this voice saying, "Hi, this is Joe Biden," and yeah, it's Joe Biden, all right. And we had an hour-long conversation about stuttering, brought on by the King's Speech, of course.
Oh, there it is.
There it is. I really think this is a very cheesy thing to do, and I never do it in public, and I'm only doing it for my fellow stutterers to show you that even from something as miserable as a stuttering childhood, occasionally you get a little golden toy like this. It's all of ours.
Leaving it on a great note. I mean, it's really important to kind of come back to the stammering, really, because this is what it's all about.
David, I wonder if you knew the effect that your film would have on the stuttering community.
I didn't imagine quite the effect it was going to have. And I was very moved by that. I've got to tell you, the emails, the letters, some of the conversations I've had with fellow stutterers are a far more important award than getting an Oscar. It really is. The fact that I've been able to give back to the stuttering community, I think, is probably the best achievement of my life.
Thank you so much. As someone who's spent my career dedicated to stuttering, to me, this was unbelievably exciting to be able to speak with both of you tonight about your personal experiences. Really, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Heather. It's been great to be part of this event.
It's always great to be part of the stuttering community. Thank you, Heather, for inviting me, being here tonight. All of you, speak up. You have a voice.